Hello, and welcome to Book of the Mouse Club, episode 94, Friday, September 29th, 2023.
Morning, monsieur.
Where are you off to?
The bookshop. I just finished the most wonderful story about a beanstalk and an ogre and...
That's nice. Marie! The baguettes! Hurry up!
I'm sorry, but how can one possibly pay attention to a book with no pictures in it?
My dear child, there are a great many good books in this world without pictures.
I almost bounced clear out of the book. Some bouncing, huh?
Come home or make myself known.
J. Thaddeus Turtle, Esquire. Have you never met him? You will find his story in this delightful little book, The Wind and the Willows.
I've come to return the book I borrowed.
Finished already?
Oh, I couldn't put it down. Have you got anything new?
Welcome back. I'm your host, Courtney, and I am joined, as always, by the Tokyo Disneyland to my Tokyo Disney Sea, my lovely co-host, Emily.
Thanks, Courtney. Also joining us today, rounding out the Jim Cora International Theme Park Trio, is our own Disneyland Paris, Brett Nachman, host of Notably Disney Podcast.
Yes, Brett was our very first guest reader on the show, joining us over 50 episodes ago on episode 40 to discuss Kevin Rafferty's Magic Journey, My Fantastical Walt Disney Imagineering Career. As host of Notably Disney, Brett covers not only Disney literature, but music as well, whether from Disney's films, Broadway shows, or even theme park attractions. We are always grateful when he invites us on to his show, and we are delighted to share in a Disney leadership duo between our two shows this week and next. Welcome, Brett.
Hey, Courtney. Hey, Emily. Glad to be with you both again. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks. We're going to have so much fun talking about both Jim Cora and Dick Nunis. And our half of the Disney leadership duo, we're going to talk about Jim Cora today. So a little bit of background on the book and on James Cora. So Not Just a Walk in the Park, My Worldwide Disney Resorts Career by James, or Jim Cora, was published by Disney Editions November 28th, 2021. This is D23's bio of Jim Cora, which will serve as a pretty good summary for our discussion today. Quote, James Cora started as a part-time Disneyland attraction host in 1957, but he credits his push from the Matterhorn bobsleds to Disneyland Administration Building to a fellow named Walt Disney. Quote, he asked me if I had an interest in training, Jim recalls. Quote, Van France was just starting the university and he was looking for 5 guys. A few years later, while working for Retlaw Enterprises, a Disney family-owned company, Jim was part of the operating team for Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room. Jim graduated from California State University, Long Beach in 1962 with a Bachelor of Arts in English. He also attended a 2-year executive management program at the University of Southern California. For 10 years, Jim held positions of increasing responsibility and management in Disneyland. In 1971, he assisted in the opening of the Magic Kingdom at Walt Disney World, implementing the Disney Way of Leadership program. In 1974, as staff assistant to Dick Nunis, president of Walt Disney Attractions, Jim redesigned the Disneyland Park operating organization to the area concept, becoming one of 3 production directors for the park responsible for Fantasyland and Tomorrowland. In 1979, Jim assumed the responsibilities of managing director of operations for Tokyo Disneyland Project. In this capacity, he was responsible for all operational planning and management hiring for Tokyo Disneyland. In preparation for the opening of Tokyo Disneyland, Jim was promoted to vice president, Walt Disney Productions Japan Limited. He relocated to Japan and was fundamental in providing ongoing support and advice to the Oriental Land Company, owner and operator of Tokyo Disneyland, as well as overseeing Disney's operational and design standards. In 1983, Jim returned to California and assumed the position of vice president, Disneyland International. In 1985, he was responsible for negotiating the agreements, master planning, and site research of the Disneyland Paris project. In 1987, he was promoted to executive vice president and chief operating officer for Euro Disneyland Corporation. In 1995, this guy has quite a resume. He was promoted to president, Disneyland International, responsible for the development and creative direction of Tokyo Disneyland, in addition to directing the strategic and creative development of Tokyo Disney Sea. In 1999, he's again promoted to chairman, Disneyland International, where his primary focus was to develop and maintain the strategies that ensured the continued growth and success of Tokyo Disney Resort. He retired from that position in 2001 after 43 years with Disney. After retirement, Jim was heavily involved in volunteer work, including with taller San Jose Hope Builders, and for years was on the board of directors of St. Joseph Hospital in Orange, where he passed away. He had recently completed his memoir, the memoir we're reading today, which is published, like I said, by Disney Editions. To write his memoir, he had also brought in Disney historian Jeff Curdy. So they worked on this project together. So we'll talk about Jeff Curdy a little bit. We've both read, all of us here have read books by him. Curdy is a creative director, content consultant, and media producer for the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco. He has been a producer, writer, speaker, and panel moderator, a consultant guest speaker at the Experience Music Project, Museum of the Rockies, and Paradiso Officers Club. Some of Curdy's books include The Disney Monorail, Imagineering a Highway in the Sky, The Art of Disney Costuming, Heroes, Villains, and Spaces Between, Disneyland Through the Decades, A Photographic Celebration, From All of Us to All of You, Disney Christmas Card, several Art of Disney books, and Travels with Walt Disney, A Photographic Voyage Around the World, which we read and interviewed with Jeff in episode 42 of our podcast. So that was a lot. Jim Cora has quite a resume, which this was almost 450 pages of a book. And Jeff Curdy will talk about his expertise as well. But let's get this discussion rolling. So what did we think of Jim Cora's memoir?
Well, first, I want to thank Brett for putting it on our radar. You gave us the choice of reading Dick Nunis or Jim Cora for your show. And I said, well, why not both? We'll do Dick Nunis for you and Jim Cora for here. And I don't know that I would have picked this book up otherwise, because I was not familiar with Jim's work and his legacy. The name was somewhat familiar, likely from the book that we did regarding the windows on Main Street. I'm sure they touched on his, because it was international, and he has 3 windows across various Disney parks. So I know that I knew the name, but would not have been able to be like, oh yeah, this was everything he did. So I was very glad to have read this and learned more about what I would say is probably an underrated Disney legend.
Yeah, similarly, I can't say I was terribly familiar with Jim Cora or his work. I remember when Jeff was developing the infrastructure for this book. I think it was back in 2020, I had interviewed Jeff to talk about The Art of Mulan, because it was reissued for with the live action film debuting, and he was telling me about how exciting this project was. And I can clearly see why now. This is a very expansive perspective into someone's life. It's meant to be, right? It's an autobiography, but it's obviously with Jeff's storytelling as well, to be able to carry across Jim's legacy and his rich set of experiences. It was much more in depth than I think I had bargained for. And I think because it's so fresh in our minds, having just read Dick Nunis's book, in terms of one way to take an autobiography. And then this is another approach. Leadership is a common thread across both of them, and yet it manifested extremely differently in some respects for both of them as well. I thought this was a nice cultural history to some extent too, because I felt like that was explored. And I know we'll talk about that briefly. I felt like it was very elaborate. There were some stories and experiences that are very familiar to those of us who are Disney history connoisseurs, and then other points that definitely came across as unfamiliar. And I'm glad I had the opportunity to learn about someone who wasn't totally on my radar. And I think importantly so too, we see some typical narratives from who had been in leadership roles in Disney over time, and often that common narrative is a white man. And here we have the experience of someone who's Lebanese. We have increasingly seen more stories from women in leadership roles, and I think it's really important that Disney is creating space to honor the wide variety of individuals who have been an important part of the company's history over the decade.
I think I'm going to echo a lot of the same responses, that I was really excited to read about someone that I also was not super familiar with. I think you're right, Courtney, when we touched on Windows on Main Street, the name is familiar, but I couldn't connect that his main contributions to the Walt Disney Company was the international projects. I think we often think about maybe some Imagineers, like we've talked about Tony Baxter, we talked about Kevin Rafferty and the projects and specific attractions they brought over. We usually associate the CEOs like right away. You're like, oh, you're Disney, Disneyland Paris, Michael Eisner, Frank Wells. But you don't think about maybe the people who actually did all the work, all the ground with the organizing, the team he was on to actually construct the project. So reading his story was really, really interesting. And I think we're going to talk about Jeff Curdy and like the history part, but this was really dense with history. So while he shared a lot of personal stories, I was really impressed with the level of detail. There were dates, there were places. He named a lot of people that in some other memoirs we've read, people get named, but like I was surprised, for instance, how much he talked about his work with Dick Nunis, whereas when we talk about Dick Nunis with you, he barely mentions Jim Cora. So Jim, I think, has a really, I mean, his book is also thicker. We'll give him that. He took more real estate. But he really gives a lot of credit, and he sounds very humble in his writing and sharing his stories and his accomplishments. So he was, voice-wise, he was also very pleasant to read.
I liked that he started his story with his rich family history. It's an immigrant story coming from what he refers to as the old country. How do you think that those roots enhanced his Disney story?
I think it offers a sense of place and context. I almost felt like I was just watching a movie of a family coming over a century ago, and as illustrated, there's much more in the way of historical references here than in Dick Nunis's book, right? Talking about World War II and different events and throughout the 30s and 40s as well. I think what really came across was I got to know some of the core people in Jim Cora's family, and that he came from a household that was rich with different experiences based on language and geography, and this notion of not only acclimating to American culture, but also still honoring the parts of themselves that go back many generations. I felt like it felt visceral. That's probably the best way I can put it. Reading this, it all came across in a very tangible manner, and I think that's a testament to the details that Jim was able to relay, and Jeff too, in telling that story. And as readers, we can appreciate it. It's a Disney story because it's a Disney career, but it's also about an individual. And having started from that place allowed me to feel connected with him, and really appreciate too a recurring theme is that Jim mentions is this notion of appreciating people for their differences, and that for him it was just natural that like, oh, I'm perhaps different than a lot of folks I'm around, and I'm accepting and understanding as a result. And we see that manifest at different times, and I think that also goes back to that family history piece, because they were othered, they were different than the people who they were immediately around, but look at how they thrived, and look at how they continue to honor their heritage over the years too.
I really loved at the end of in the epilogue, the first sentence of the epilogue says, quote, "I was born of the American dream and the immigrant tradition of innovation and family business," end quote. And I think he does make a really interesting connection that we do associate Disney so much with Americana, but I think with his family story, as well as what he goes on to bring Disney internationally to so many different places, and having to integrate Disney with different cultures and different cultures with Disney's culture, I think it's just such a beautiful round story of how he is an integration of multiple cultures and multiple perspectives. I also liked, like you said, Brett, that getting to know him as a person and in his family before his Disney story, and that connection I feel like is so important, because I feel like sometimes when we talk about Disney legends and Disney people, were like, what did they learn from Disney? What did Disney bring them? But he learned a lot that he gives credit to his education, his family, that he brought with him to Disney. We all bring something to the professions and the spheres that we're all part of. So while he credits a lot of things that he learned from Disney, he also says, I brought this here. So just as much as Disney's informing him, our cast members and our leadership informs Disney as well, which I think that's a really nice credit to his family, and that they deserved a place in the story.
I appreciated the metaphor of growing where you're planted. That was really present through the story of his grandmother's grape leaves and yogurt starter that came from the old country, and they would cut off a shoot of this vine anytime somebody moved or got married in his family, and they would plant it. So that's something that he literally and physically did, but it definitely became a metaphor for as he's moving through these different seasons of life, putting down roots, planting himself, so much so that it was a clear line throughout it that each page of the starting page of each chapter had like a grape design. So he really wanted to drive home that point, and I felt that was well done.
Oh my gosh, at the end, they do have a credit page at the end about his passing, because he passed, I think, guess before the book actually came out. He finished the book, but he passed before its publication date. But when he's writing his epilogue and he's reflecting on, I had such a beautiful life, he's like, and I can see the starter pot on my shelf. And I was like, oh, and then we know he passed, and like, and we started and we stopped. I was like, it was just a beautiful, I don't know, maybe it's the fiction reader in me where I like those closed loop moments where the beginning is the same as the end. And it was, I was heart touched reading that, and that made me very happy.
Well, hallmark stories of Disney legends of Walt's time are when they met Walt, when Walt passed away, certainly when we're focusing on these legends from who were pivotal in the 50s, 60s, and onward. What were your thoughts when reading Jim's recollections of these milestones or common moments that manifest in Disney biographies and autobiographies?
So these are always, I think, fun stories, like we said, of the legends. He and Dick Nunis, because we'll talk about both of them, they have very different entrances into the Disney family, into the Disney company. So I thought that was kind of fun. Like they referenced in his D23 bio, he's like, hey, do you have an interest in training? And it literally was just because he's walking across the park holding all these manuals. And Disney goes, what's that? And then goes, I want to give you a new job. And that's like how he met Walt Disney, was just like running down Main Street, just carrying a whole bunch of books when they were trying to create manuals for attractions. And that sounds like such a Walt thing to me from all the times we've heard about Walt, if he just has this innate curiosity and just goes, hey, what are you doing? And then that launched his entire career just because he happened to pass Walt Disney at that time, carrying something, just a pile of books, and it made Walt ask what he's doing. But something that stood out to me with Walt's passing was he didn't really spend a lot of time on it. It was like half a page and a half, not even. He wasn't quite as emotional as I thought he would be in his writing about Walt's passing, but I think he was more emotional about afterwards when he talked about the first candlelight processional in Disneyland without Walt. That was more of a pivotal moment of recognizing he's gone than like the shock of the day. What did you guys take from what he wrote?
Yeah, I would agree. And I feel like that might be just due to the fact that he acknowledges, he didn't work closely with Walt. Dick Nunis's book is called Walt's Apprentice. Like, he is obviously going to be more affected versus, yes, Jim Cora had this pivotal moment with him, but I think he starts to see more of the aftermath as somebody working in operations of like, well, what do we do without Walt? Like, that's where it really hits him more in a way that's like, oh, how does this affect me in my role versus, yes, it's sad that Walt Disney passed, but I didn't have a deeply personal relationship with him as other people and biographies that we've read have had.
And that's okay, right? Different folks have different traditions in terms of how they discuss their interactions with Walt. We know as very thorough readers of everything Disney that Walt was a blunt individual, and he could kind of say it like it is. And what was really fascinating was to see that Jim Cora felt very emboldened to talk very directly to Walt in those initial interactions, saying some of these attractions don't have trained people. And he recognizes there's this self-awareness looking back, like that was maybe a little bit direct, but that actually kind of led to a point where Walt said, okay, work with Van Frans, get involved in training measures. And I thought that was kind of fascinating to hear how emboldened Jim Cora was.
And I think we've heard that in a few places. Dick Nunis will talk about some of his interactions with Walt, but other stories we've read that that you can be a direct person with Walt. And people who said they were scared to, but almost every single interaction we had, either Raleigh Crump trying to like, dude, I don't think this is a good idea for the World's Fair, or in this case, Jim Cora being like, your park is not as well trained as you think it is. Like everyone's like, I'm a little afraid to say that to Walt because he's Walt Disney. But over and over again, we see that like Walt can take it. He's happy to hear, or he's welcoming to hear those harsh truths that he needs to. So this isn't the first time we've seen that happen, or at least for me in readings, which I thought was just another interesting, like you said, interaction. Like, we're all kind of apprehensive, like, do you say that to Walt? But they do. After that, though, we know he has quite a career at Disneyland. He comes in, what is that, 1957? So it's still really early in Disneyland. So he wasn't there for, what was it, Black Sunday is what they called it, opening day, but he has a lot of experience. So what elements of early Disneyland did we pick up and find interesting from Cora's lens?
Definitely his hiring story. So he shares that he basically is giving a friend a ride to Disneyland because his friend wants to apply for a job there. And while he's, about to drop his friend off, whoever the hiring manager is like, oh, do you want a job too? And he's like, nah, I'm just here to take my friend. And he's like, okay, well, the manager's like, you want to go into the park for free? And I was just floored that they're like, yeah, here's a pass to go into the park for free because you came here to get your friend here for an interview. And he's like, it only took an hour and I was hooked. So thank goodness for that free pass, because he realized just what a wonderful place Disneyland was and how much he did want to be a part of it. But I was pretty shook that they were just giving out free passes if you were the carpool guy, I guess.
Well, I gleaned some, I love that too. I gleaned some interesting tidbits about things I hadn't really given much thought to. One was, in the early days of Fantasyland, there was the Mickey Mouse Club Theater, and they showed 3D pieces there. And people have heard about this, and there hasn't been a whole lot documented on it. But this was the 50s, so there weren't necessarily, at least for this, there weren't machines to handle it. So who was cleaning those 3D glasses? Jim. I think not that that's the most fascinating tidbit, but it's the notion of, like, there was a lot of manual work that perhaps folks don't always give as much thought to. I loved some of the notions of Jim really elevating folks' training opportunities. So there was a second day of orientation offered for each division, so that folks could, again, be more adept in their line of work. And that had some pushback, right? It's extra time, extra resources, but ultimately it benefited everybody. And this notion of giving folks opportunities, I think, extended itself to where Jim was really a proponent of women having opportunities. He was there was an anecdote about him providing a female foreman to handle a job when ultimately that wasn't necessarily the norm those days in the 60s. And so what I took away from early Disneyland was that, it was still in very much a rough and experimental state, but because of certain folks and pioneers like Jim Cora trying to make it a richer experience for the guests by virtue of making it a richer experience for the cast members, it was a very rewarding time for folks who had the means to do that. And that's where him being, I think, very brazen was quite a positive in many respects.
That story stood out to me also, the promoting of the female foreman for the day. And then they just kept saying, like, because they were down a person. So they're like, well, you know the job, you take it over. And then they just kind of kept saying, you're still in charge. And I thought that was really cool. Something I kind of took away, though, is he talked about how he bounced around a lot in the park. He started in Fantasyland, then he ends up in Main Street. And he's like, I don't know Main Street. But I think what I took from it was, as a former cast member, Courtney, you've worked in operations. I think we sometimes take for granted the efficiency of how Disney trains and the efficiency of, like, well, if you're like, that role can be standardized, like or that role can be transferred. I don't want to say standardized, but like transferred with those skills to other places. I had friends in my DCP who were merchandise, and some days they got moved to a whole new park because they needed people and they could just do the job because they knew that job. They weren't tied to one location. They weren't, they could transfer those skills with their training. And I feel like we take that for granted now of how that's just how Disney does things. But looking at his experience where he's like, his origin story, people didn't know training. And that's how he got connected with Walt. And then starting all that training, being part of that training program with Van France and Dick Nunis, like, it had to start somewhere. And I think we sometimes take for granted that, like, Disney wasn't just this efficient, clean. They had those ideas, but it did take some trial and error to figure out how to do that. Luckily now they've been doing it really well for 60 some years, but it took a lot of time.
It was nice to see that come together between Dick Nunis's story as well as this one, the foundations of Disney traditions, literally the class that cast members take and how they shaped that all together. So in working with Dick Nunis and other leadership, we've seen not only did Jim Cora have an opportunity to work for Walt, but he also worked with other iconic leaders like Michael Eisner, Frank Wells, of course, Dick Nunis, Marty Sklar, etc. What stood out to you from these interactions? I felt like he was rather candid in his opinions about some of them.
So we've talked about how Jim Cora, and Dick Nunis crossed paths. And what I got out of those interactions or their dynamics were that, Dick Nunis was comparably a bit more abrasive and harsh and even more direct than Jim Cora. And I kind of gleaned that, perhaps, maybe they didn't always see eye to eye on everything. They were perhaps some common values of efficiency and making sure people were well trained, but their approaches were not necessarily always in tandem. So I think that was just an interesting comparison, if you will, given that we've engaged now with both of these autobiographies. That really stood out to me because it's been so fresh in my mind.
I really liked a couple things. I agree that he was much more candid than I think when we talk about Dick Nunis's book. I feel like Dick's very diplomatic in the way he talks about all of his colleagues, and he'll allude that maybe we didn't get along, and he leaves it there. Whereas Jim Cora is willing, not nastily. I think he talks about these interactions and how people may have not seen eye to eye very fairly. He gave them credit for this was their standpoint, and this is why I just did not agree. So I think he did it very fairly, but he was more willing to talk about his experiences with those leaders. One that I thought was funny, and I think he gives a lot of credit. I like that Frank Wells got a lot of time, because I feel like, unfortunately, other than his passing, and he does get the credit for being like that balancing duo to Michael Eisner, I do think we hear of Michael Eisner so much more. He was a bigger personality. He's more fun to talk about. So I like the amount of time that Frank Wells got. And I love the story where Frank Wells is like, hey, I want to talk to you about something. Come have lunch in my office. And his secretary goes to set it up and says, oh, what do you want for lunch? And Cora's like, oh, jokingly, I said, how about some pizza and beer with the boss? And pizza and beer was there, but Frank had his salad all set up. And Frank was like, oh, that looks really good. Screw it. I'm not having the salad today. And he's like, and that's how I ended up having pizza and beer with the CEO of Disney. And I thought that was just such a fun story and gave Frank some life that I don't think we always see. People credit that he was a good guy, but I liked to see how I liked having a personal story for Frank Wells. One that stood out to me, though, is he very much did not get along with Jeffrey Katzenberg when it came to Euro Disneyland Paris. So that was really interesting to see how that interaction out of how studios was also influencing what's happening in parks. And as an operations guy, that made him not happy.
Yeah, I think it's Jeffrey Katzenberg's wife, right? That he's like, she came in and
she hated the merchandise.
Critiqued the merchandise. And he's like, we did all this research on the merchandise and we had to get rid of it because Jeffrey Katzenberg's wife didn't like it. And I was like, oh, don't hold back, Jim Cora. Let it out. It was interesting to me to hear Jeffrey Katzenberg mentioned in an operations based book. I'm sure he comes up in Disney War or things of the like, but I feel like he's not a common player in the more theme park centric books that the three of us have read. So I was like, ooh, we got a little Jeffrey Katzenberg mention, but no love lost between the two of them. Bridges were not burned, because towards the end in the epilogue, he's like, yeah, he invited me to Dubai to show off to this guy who wanted to build a theme park, and he's like, yeah, okay, Jeffrey, I'll come be in the room where it happens with you. So an unexpected showing for Jeffrey Katzenberg in the latter portion of the book as well.
That's a good example, though, of how he's still very fair, I think, yes, to his colleagues. And that's what I think. There's a degree of professionalism here where he can talk about how they did not get along in a decision-making standpoint, but he then credits he admired Jeffrey's character, that he had a gumption and an ambition that he was able to act on, and he went for it. He was not shy about his ambitions, and he was not afraid to try new things. So he gives them a lot of credit despite not liking when they had to work together. So that degree of professionalism is really cool to read from him as well. So speaking of those international parks, he spends a lot of time with Tokyo, which was a pleasant chapter read, but a huge chunk of this book, I think it's part 8, is his time in Europe. And you both have been to Disneyland Paris. I have not, sadly. But I kind of wanted to reflect on this section of his book, Disneyland Paris, formerly known as Euro Disney. What did you take away from Cora's experience when you reflect about your trip abroad and going to Disneyland Paris?
Well, this really made me want to go to Tokyo Disney because it's clear he likes that one a lot better and had a better time there. But I did appreciate hearing all of the hard work that went into creating Disneyland Paris. I do think it's one of the most beautiful Disney parks from a design standpoint. I have not been to all of the parks. I have been to the domestic parks at the Disneyland Resort, Walt Disney World Resort, and then Disneyland Paris. So no Tokyo Disney, Shanghai, or Hong Kong yet. I will say yet. I'm determined to get there. But of the parks I've been to, I think it's absolutely beautiful. So you can see from his recollections all the hard work that went into it, but also appreciate the challenges that he was up against, both from like the local government, the French culture, just different designers butting heads with the studio. We got a really deep glimpse into what happened there and what almost killed him. He had to go to the hospital and had some heart related problems. So that was, a lot packed into that chapter.
Yeah, it was very thorough. And, I feel like because we have some perspective into how Disney executives and Imagineers, for that matter, have evolved each of the international resorts based on lessons from prior experiences. If you all remember when Bob Iger was talking about the launch of Shanghai Disneyland, the notion of authentically Disney, distinctly Chinese, or something in that vein, and that notion of wanting to maintain what feels integral to Disney, but also accommodating the distinct culture and environment that you are now having a presence in. And there were so many learning curves with Tokyo, to be sure, but certainly with Paris and France. It just provided so much in the way of complications that's been chronicled in a wide variety of ways. But I think one of the takeaways that I got from the book, but also grounded in my experience in having been there, is just a few lines about how they were at the time when they were starting Disneyland Paris, aiming to hire folks who were full-time employees, where that was like the main emphasis. They really wanted to get folks embedded in the Disney culture, and they were very intentional in trying to hire folks who were multilingual, who spoke French and at least one other language. And certainly in going to Disneyland Paris, you recognize that among the cast members even 30 plus years after its debut. And I think that notion of really recognizing that not only is it a French park in so many ways in terms of the aesthetics and the beauty of it, but it's the most popular tourist destination in Europe, and it's a European place, and so let's honor that among our cast members as well. And I think there was such thoughtfulness in terms of what Disney wanted to accomplish, and I think Jim Cora's influence too, as alluded to earlier, like being from a different culture and wanting to enmesh yourself in the new space, but also honor what feels core. That also materialized with Disneyland Paris, and I think it's a beautiful park because it feels familiar for those of us who are from the States, but also distinct and just gorgeous because of honoring the European and in particular French heritage. I think Jim Cora really demonstrated that sense of connectivity to where you are and trying to be thoughtful, and doesn't always work out. There were a lot of pitfalls.
I found it really interesting when they were taking the vote. They were torn between Spain and France, and and I've heard that part of the story before, but I didn't know that like everyone went for Spain. And then Michael Eisner's like, we're going to France. And they're just like, okay, we're going to France. So I didn't quite catch like how one-sided that was. I thought it was maybe more of a torn decision between France and Spain. But I wonder sometimes, though, like a lot of those obstacles, would they face similar obstacles in Spain, the Spanish government versus the French government? It kind of made me curious because you could tell he was really frustrated through those years. And he was I think he said it's 7 years that he lived in France getting that together. And that's such a long project. And he said 2 out of those 7 years was just trying to get it off the ground. They couldn't even break ground yet. And then kept butting heads with Michael Eisner, who had all these grand ideas. And that's where he had to rely on Frank Wells to rein him in a little bit. But like, it just felt like, the whole time it's just like, okay, we're going to France instead of Spain. It'll be fine. And then this next thing happens. And then Michael Eisner's spending more money and changing his budgets and changing his plans. And it's just like, he's just holding on so tight. And then, with his ultimately resulting in his health crisis, which was scary to read, that we could have lost Jim Cora very easily in that time if someone didn't get him to a hospital the way that they did. So I just found that all very fascinating because I think most of the stories, at least I've read, I know there's more chronicled stuff out there where people credit the obstacles in France, but I don't think I've read an account, or at least a personal one, that was as candid of how frustrating getting Disneyland Paris together was.
Now, we're talking about a book that is many hundreds of pages. Were there any other specific stories that Jim Cora shared that stood out to each of you?
I have 2. The one I have to mention because it's in both books, and that is Green Side Up, the story of the sod laying at Disney's Contemporary Resort. More prominent in Dick Nunis's book, but I was just delighted to have, one, enjoyed that story in Dick Nunis's book, and then found out Jim Cora was there and like tells the story from his side. And I was like, it's like a multiverse like cameo or something. That was just fun reading these books in succession, one right after the other. Personally, I was like, ooh, we've reached the interlocking timeline or something. Also, really enjoyed hearing about the preparations for the Pocahontas premiere at Central Park in New York City. Some of his expanded, and other duties as assigned type projects in his, like, you're part of the parks division, but like international and other things. So he was responsible for planning this grand, the premiere, instead of being somewhere like Grauman's Chinese Theater or the El Capitan, was held in Central Park so that, like, I think 100,000 families could come see it across giant screens. And the prep that went into that, the wheelin' and the dealin' with the New York City cops, there were some fun anecdotes there. And I could tell that experience was something that he was very proud of, which would be, not the traditional legacy you'd think of. Well, we built a theme park, but we got to have this really cool monumentous occasion celebrating one of Disney's great animated features.
Courtney, that makes me think of a bonus feature that was on the Pocahontas DVD. And I'm not sure if it's on Disney Plus, but about the preparation of the premiere.
All right. Well, I got DVDs at home. I will check it out. Sorry, continue to share more about it.
No, please. And I think it's on YouTube as well. And it's just really a fascinating time capsule because you see the influence of Rudy Giuliani as New York City's mayor in that too. But I mean, it was a really fascinating premiere. I'm going to mention a tiny, it's not even really a story so much as it is a little piece of information that was kind of interesting. We know Disneyland's opening was fraught with a lot of chaotic elements and not everything working quite functionally. And he referenced how the ticket boxes in Fantasyland on opening day, well, there weren't any ticket boxes in Fantasyland on opening day. So what were they doing with the tickets? Because again, this was the age of the ABCDE tickets. Oh, we'll just use trash cans and pockets to collect them. So again, it's just this kind of can-do spirit. Not everything works out the way you intend, but we'll make it work.
You all stole my stories.
Are you serious?
The ones that stuck out to me.
Emily, how is that possible?
It's a 450-page book. Like, what?
Like, I mean, those were the ones that I thought were fun, that were really fun. Yeah.
They were not traditional. It's okay. We've read, I feel like, a lot of stuff between the three of us, so those were very unique. But wow, what?
Well, what
are the chances?
Well, because I like the Pocahontas one because it reminded me of we're listeners of the Disorder podcast, and Michael Lyons went to. So that I was like, oh yeah, Michael Lyons was there, and oh my gosh, Jim Cora was there. So that stood out to me as well. I think just some other things I found interesting. I'm going to go back to the Tokyo chapter, just kind of an overall theme, going back to like family and culture. I thought, as a history teacher, so I'm going to go all history on this. I really enjoyed, and we talk about this with Dick Nunis' book as well, that they don't ignore the context of history of they're opening a park in Japan only 30, 40 years after World War II. A lot of the people who are working and designing Disney are veterans of World War II. And it was a moment for both sides to, this is a new adventure. They were talking about, who was it? That was the veteran that took a little, yes,
Card Walker, the kamikaze, had been attacked by kamikaze pilots.
I appreciate that he brought that context of history, because I feel like often when not even just studying Disney history, but any particular one subject, it can be really hard to lose that context. I was teaching context this week in my class. And I thought that was really poignant. I think why he has so much respect for how, and appreciation and pride in how Tokyo Disney and Tokyo Disney Sea came together, because of that relationship that really had to be prepared of how do Japanese view American culture, how do Americans view the Japanese, or particularly for these people, a lot of people who are veterans. And I thought that was a really interesting, he wrote about that so well. And then again, crediting how his experience over and over, and I think something we can take away as maybe even a life lesson from this book is when you immerse yourselves in those other cultures, those prejudice, that breaks down. He's like, I saw immediately the propaganda that was being pushed in wartime that the Japanese were the enemy. And he's like, they're not. They're people like us. We had animosity. We had world problems and world conflicts, but that doesn't mean you degrade a whole culture. And he talks about that. I think those lessons that he took from Tokyo, and then the hardships that he had trying to integrate that culture, because Japanese were really excited about Disney, and then France was not very excited about Disney. But I think all of those experiences, starting in that chapter, you really see how he took what he learned from each park opening and how he brought that to Disney Sea, how then he brought that to recommendations for other international parks.
I'd love to hone in on that idea of lessons, because that is definitely something that is at play in both of these books. I think you picked them, Brett, based on these being Disney leaders. Dick Nunis' book very clearly has leadership lessons at the end of every chapter. We will be going into them deeply on your show. But that's not to say that Jim Cora's doesn't. Cora, it might not be clearly spelled out, but as you already picked up on some of them, Emily, he emulates leadership too. What lessons about leadership did you pick up from Cora's career besides what you already shared?
Well, I would say one point that stands out, and I'd say this is echoed in Dick Nunis's work too. Get to know everyone's job by getting your hands dirty. Walk the walk. Literally, in Dick Nunis's case, walk a marathon each day. But for Jim Cora, it's, if you have an understanding of all different levels of an operation, it's going to make everything more efficient and engage in perspective taking. That came through. I'll just leave it there.
I think that's one that he carries throughout the book, because he says, I think it's with Jeffrey Katzenberg, that he's like, he clearly didn't take the time to understand how we work, or he likes to say that over and over, like, take it apart and put it back together. He didn't take the time, or with other people he's worked with, that he can tell when you don't take that time. Something that stood out to me, I think along the same lines, is when he was, I really hope I'm remembering this right from this book and not Dick Nunis's, reading them back to back, that leadership, or like a supervisor in one area of the park, like, you don't say, like, that's not my job. Doesn't matter. You're in the area. If it needs fixing, it needs help. I think it was like, don't drop your trash. It doesn't matter if that's not your job. You do it anyway. And we still see that now in Disney, where you'll see supervisors carrying around, what do they call the
Nabby Grabbies.
Nabby Grabbies. That was right. I really like that, because I think sometimes we get stuck in, or like sometimes you hope from your leadership that just because it's not your job, that doesn't mean you can't step in. That doesn't mean you can't help, even if it's, quote, below you.
Yeah, and I also like the idea of, putting down roots, growing where you're planted, but also being willing to uproot yourself. He traveled pretty much all the way around the globe. I feel like if he made it multiple times, to Japan, to Paris, to Disneyland, to Walt Disney World, being willing to say yes to those opportunities, being able to learn from the people who have the expertise in those other cultures. While they weren't little quippy life lessons at the end of each chapter, they did very clearly come through in the storytelling here.
Well, and maybe as a connection point to storytelling, we're actually hearing a story from multiple perspectives. It is Jim Cora's story, but it's told not only by him, but by Jeff Curdy, who we referred to earlier. And Emily gave, I think, a very great and extensive bio of Jeff's work. And it's listed right on the book. If you look at the look at the description, the most prolific nonfiction legacy author in Disney history. That's what's indicated here. We know his work across a variety of different types of nonfiction. In what ways would you each see Curdy come through and how Cora's story is presented?
Well, I think this was a big contrast for me between how Cora's story is written and Dick Nunis's. And that's not to say Dick Nunis did not have a wonderful story. But as we talk about on your podcast, like Dick Nunis, it feels like a conversation. Whereas I got history out of this book. I think that level of context and corroboration, I'm using all the historical thinking skills today. I think that comes through with having a historian work with you, where we got Jim Cora's voice, but I'm sure Jim Cora did not remember in his older age every single person he worked with, the exact dates of when things open. And you can tell that working with a historian, that level of detail is what makes its way into Cora's story, where Dick Nunis' story, we had moments where we were like, oh, I want to know a little bit more, but it sounds more of just like a personal anecdote versus a well-researched one with anecdotes in it.
Yeah, I think he's just a master storyteller who has been through so much with Disney. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think I caught in the epilogue, Jim Cora was responsible for hiring Jeff Curdy at some point in his Disney career. So I thought that was what a wonderful way to come back together to then get to tell Jim's story from Jeff's side and bring his writing talents to the page here.
Yeah, it is kind of like what we were talking about earlier. It is nice when things kind of go full circle. I think what we have to appreciate here is that it's not an easy task to really cover a whole person's life, and really that's what this whole book was, right? Because of course Jim Cora passed before its publication. I think Jeff had the arduous job, but also the great honor of being able to take it to the finish line and to really be able to help pull out some of those memories and experiences, and that requires a very adept historian and scholar and someone who knows their stuff. I think that was a really nice component that he was able to pull on. But what I want to emphasize with Jim Cora's book, I feel like both Dick Nunis's book and Jim Cora's book were really helpful in understanding the Disney organization across a variety of contexts. But I felt like I felt more of Jim. I felt more of Jim's soul in the writing, and I think that is probably a credit to both Jim and Jeff in concert. Dick Nunis's book was structured in a very different format. It was these little piecemeal anecdotes and the lessons learned for each, and I think that was really nice. It was very digestible. It jumped around at times chronologically, but ultimately it was like I described on that podcast, very much a leadership book, and there was a life story woven within, and it was very fascinating, and I enjoyed that for what that book represented. This book, on the other hand, feels like a true chronology of someone's life mixed with world history, which you were talking about at length, Emily, which I feel like is so important because I felt like I got more than just learning about someone's life. I got to learn about Disney as an institution, both domestically and internationally, how world events factored into that interplay, and also just Jim Cora, someone who was, for all intents and purposes, an underdog, someone who perhaps you wouldn't have expected him to rise to the levels in which he had based on just different various factors. But his spirit really came through in the book, and I think Jeff was really effective in being able to demonstrate that in tandem. So there was one of you had mentioned earlier the humanity that came across in this book, and I really loved that authenticity. He kind of tells it straight, but there's always a sense of heart as well.
I think overall we had a lot of fun talking about both Dick Nunis and Jim Cora. I think now we all need a mission, now that we understand Jim Cora a lot more and have appreciation for him, that we should try to see all 3 of his windows. Because he said there's only 3 people in the Walt Disney Company that have windows in multiple places, both domestically and internationally. And that's him, Walt, and Frank Wells, right? Was that the 3rd? Courtney, you mentioned that. So I think we need to make a pilgrimage to Tokyo together just to see Jim Cora. I think we can make that happen.
Who's footing the bill, though, Emily?
I mean, where's the guy that's just going to offer us, oh, you're here? Here's a free entry. Where's him? We should...
Yeah, I'm just dropping someone off for a job.
Can we get into Tokyo Disney?
Where's my free pass?
So this was so much fun to talk about both Jim Cora and Dick Nunis. But new memoirs keep coming out all the time. This is the 3rd memoir that we've now read together. And this is becoming a big staple of the company's centennial celebration, especially as the 55ers get older and we're losing more people to age and natural passage of time who used to work with Walt. So these memoirs are so important. But if we could get anyone else's memoir, celebrating Disney Centennial, if you could get a Disney person's memoir, who would you want?
I want Tony Baxter. I feel like he is mentioned in this. Has his handprints all over Disneyland Paris, a huge part of that. So maybe that's just why that was on my mind, particularly in reading Jim Cora's book. But I also selfishly love the Imagination Pavilion and would love more details from his experiences creating that and his legacy. I feel like he just would have a lot of fun to stay. I believe he's someone who grew up visiting the parks. He's that second wave of Imagineering, which would be a lot of fun.
Are we keeping it to just Imagineers or thinking about it more broadly?
Whoever you want, Brett. You got 100 years to cover of history.
That's too hard. My first thought was Tony Baxter. I'm going to give a shout out to Joe Rohde. But I feel like each, kind of like in Jim Cora's book, each chapter was highlighted by a little insignia of the, you said the grapevine. I think it should just be like a different piece of his earring. Like is each chapter like a silhouette of that? Joe Rohde, of course, being the famed Imagineer responsible for Disney's Animal Kingdom and Aulani and many other projects. If memory serves me right, he's not yet a formal Disney legend, and I feel like his time is due. And I would love to read a book that he is responsible for crafting, because he's an extremely intelligent individual, very worldly, and is a masterful storyteller.
Well, why I wanted to also say Joe Rohde is, as much as I'm appreciating that we're getting these memoirs, particularly from people before we lose them to time, especially those who worked in early Disneyland, I do think in the Centennial, we do also have to celebrate kind of that second half of the Centennial. And even though Animal Kingdom is not that, quote, old, it's not Disneyland in its legacy quite yet, but that's like the 3rd wave of Disney. Like, where are we coming in now? And I think it's important to also get these stories maybe while they are, before they're, like, he's still in his prime. He's very active. He's still doing things. So I would love to get his story now, when then maybe we can still like with Kevin Rafferty, we were able to talk to him about it. We're able to ask him more questions. Whereas unfortunately now, like, we can't ask Jim Cora anymore. So I think there's a value too in getting some of these younger voices in Disney history, or newer voices in the latter half of the Centennial, and getting some of their stories. And us being Parks fans, I'm not surprised that we all went the park route and Imagineering.
All lots of great options that will continue to keep us reading and keep us connected. We like to wrap up with resources, which we all have picked one, but there's also an extra special resource, a whole nother episode between the 3 of us over on the Notably Disney podcast. So if you are listening to this on our feed between Friday and Monday that it came out, you'll just have to wait till Tuesday. But if it's after Tuesday, October 3rd, then you're good to go. You can hop on over to Notably Disney, which Brett will tell you all about where to find as we close out the show, to hear our discussion of Dick Nunis as part of our Disney leadership duo between these 2 shows. But of course, we didn't want to leave you without any other resources of our choosing. So I have picked the Imagineering story. Now, I did not have time to go back and watch all 6 episodes, so I'm not sure if Jim Cora appears in the Imagineering story. Brett, do you happen to know? Not to put you on the spot. It's okay if you don't.
And I've only watched this show probably 3 different times, and I'm trying to think. I can't remember off the
I don't
top
think he
of my
does.
head.
I was trying to Google it, and I wasn't getting anything. So while he may or may not appear in it, I did feel that it really enhanced not only Jim Cora's, but Dick Nunis's as well, because Dick Nunis definitely appears. That comes up on our discussion, like 15 years apart. But that goes into a lot of detail regarding Tokyo Disney Sea, and also the dual construction of California Adventure, and of course Disneyland Paris and the challenges that were met there, as well as Disney's America. That got a little nod in this book as well. So I just felt like it was such a great compliment to both of those books that really chronicle a long period in Disney history. And I just want any excuse to go back and watch all 6 of those wonderful episodes.
The resource I wanted to offer, now this is one that I haven't experienced, but it was mentioned in the book. Jim Cora talked about The Disney Way of Leadership by Van France. Now I'm trying to find it, but Van France apparently wrote this down somewhere. So Van France is someone who we read about in both Jim Cora and Dick Nunis's memoirs quite extensively. He's mentioned a lot. He's really important to both of them. Maybe he's a memoir we need. We need Van France, a Van France memoir or biography in the centennial. But if anyone can find that, I'd be really interested to see what he writes about leadership, because both Jim Cora and Dick Nunis talk about how much they learned from him actually working with him to create the training programs that has now made Disney some of the leadership empires as a corporation. So if anyone can find that, we'd love to see that.
Good picks. I would go with, even though Walt Disney World wasn't necessarily a focal point of this book, maybe relegated to a few dozen pages more specifically, I would recommend, for more context on its development, Realityland: True Life Adventures of Walt Disney World by David Koenig. It was published about 15 years ago, and it has some really fun chapters on Walt Disney World's evolution. Jim Cora makes an appearance a few times in the book. There's, of course, a number of books on Walt Disney World's development, so by no means is this the exclusive one that you should check out, but I think it may offer some additional perspective, and I would love to see more literature come out related to the international Disney theme parks. There was a great one on Disneyland Paris's development. The name is escaping me off the top of my head, but there's some good work out there. It just needs to surface more.
Lots of great options to tide you over until our next episode in October. We will be welcoming back author Spencer Wright to talk about his new book, The Enchanted Disney: Stories of Walt, Hollywood, and Live Action Film. Here's a brief synopsis from the back of the book. Quote, in its centennial year, take a journey through the history of the Walt Disney Company through the lens of the studio's live-action films and the life of its co-creator, Walt Disney. By discussing the life and work of 15 people who contributed to live-action features, you will learn about what influenced the studio's films and how they related to Hollywood as a whole. How did Walt's experience in 1920s Los Angeles compare to others, such as Silent Queen Pola Negri? How did major celebrities see Walt and his studio as it fit the landscape of the industry? Which star was inspired to help preserve Hollywood memorabilia as a result of spending time with Walt in Disneyland at the park's opening? These questions and many more will be answered in 15 chapters, taking us on a journey from the early 1900s and into the 21st century, end quote. So we look forward to welcoming Spencer back to the show to talk about his new book in mid-October. His book is available on Amazon and linked in our show notes. And Brett, I believe you had a chance to chat with Spencer about his book as well.
Yeah, there were a bunch of interesting stories about different, almost hidden figures, if you will, in Disney history. So I'll look forward to hearing more about your conversation with him too.
Yeah, we got double the fun between both of our shows for each of these episodes. In the meantime, of course, you can keep up with Book of the Mouse Club on Twitter /X and Instagram @Book of the Mouse. Email us with comments or ideas to bookofthemouseclub@gmail.com. And please be sure to leave us a review on iTunes so others may find our podcast and read and listen along with us. If you want to keep up with me, Courtney, I'm on Instagram @GreatGutsby and on Twitter /X @Courtney_Guth.
And you can follow me, Emily, on Instagram and Twitter @Emily_McD. And Brett, where can readers keep up with you and Notably Disney?
I have to remind myself of what platforms I'm on. So Notably Disney, you can check us out on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you get your podcast. I produce 2 episodes a month, so it'll be the first and third Tuesdays of each month. So look forward to you checking that out. As far as me and I guess alerts of upcoming episodes of Notably Disney, you can follow me on Twitter /X @BNACHMAN Reports. So it's B. Nachman Reports. I also have to remind myself I joined Instagram. I'm not terribly active on said platform, but I have to remind myself of my username. It is Dr. Nachman, so DrNachman, Dr. Nachman. You can find me there. And if I didn't mention already, notably Disney@gmail.com. But such a pleasure to talk with you both.
I just realized we never celebrated you having your PhD because I don't think that was complete the last time you were on here. So, Dr. Nachman, next time I do the introduction. Sorry about that.
Not at all. And I'll add for the listeners that Emily and Courtney were at my doctorate celebration virtual event, and it was a lovely memory. So I'm glad you've been part of my journey as well. So
yes. We got a whole collection of doctors. Dr. Doug, Dr. Paul, Dr. Brett. Next time I'm putting it in the bio to celebrate you. No, he's shaking his head, so maybe not. He's very humble. But Dr. Nachman, what have you selected as our closing quote?
I struggled with picking out a good quote because there were tons of good ones in this very voluminous book. So I'm going to mention one that I really liked. It's on page 64. So Cora writes, "You have to cultivate people. This isn't about training," he'd, referring to Van France, would say. "It's about developing people." I just think that's a nice sentiment.
Definitely is, and there were so many to choose from. So I'm glad that you picked a good one, and also very glad that you had the idea for us to do both of these books between our two podcasts. I'm sure many more to come between our libraries. So thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you both. Always enjoy it.
Of the Mouse Club has no affiliation with the Walt Disney Company. The views and opinions expressed by hosts and participants are theirs and theirs alone. They do not represent the organizations or companies they happen to work for.